What's up? Alexander here with Date Psychology. So today, female narcissism. Gonna share this paper with you. Female narcissism, assessment, etiology, and behavioral manifestations. This is a review paper looking at how female narcissism manifests differently. Some sex differences in this. We know men are diagnosed more narcissism. Why is that? What is going on? Let's go ahead and get into it. So narcissism, where does it come from, right? You probably know this already, but go over it really quickly. The myth of Narcissus, right? A guy, he was exceptionally beautiful. He stared into the water, fell in love with his own reflection. So kind of gives you an idea of what's going on with narcissism. Where did this come from? There's a whole history of this. The term was originally coined to describe individuals who were sort of had an autoerotic fixation with themselves. Later it became narcissistic personality disorder. Subclinical narcissistic traits like you find in the dark triad scales, that sort of a thing. So let's just go on and see. What are we looking at here in this paper? We're talking about clinical narcissism, so narcissism as diagnosed, narcissistic personality disorder, but a lot of this is also going to apply to trait narcissism, right? So narcissism as a personality trait, subclinical, not the disorder. But here are the DSM-5 criteria for narcissism. So these are the kind of things that we're going to be looking at, and this is kind of important to understand what is going on as we go forward here. There's 9 kind of things going on. So we have a grandiose sense of self-importance, a preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, that sort of a thing, a belief that he or she is special and unique and can only be understood by other special, unique, high-status kinds of people, a need for excessive admiration, sense of entitlement, interpersonally exploitative behavior, lack of empathy, big one, envy of others, another big one, or the belief that others are envious of them, and a demonstration of arrogant or haughty behaviors or attitudes. So clinical diagnosis of narcissism here. Give you an idea of what is going on. Let's go on now to the next slide. Sex differences in narcissistic personality disorder. We also see sex differences in subclinical narcissism, right? Or narcissism as a personality trait. But we know men are about 75% more likely to be diagnosed, right? In the general population, it's estimated that about 7.7% of men are narcissists and about 4.8% of women. So a little bit less than twice as many men. Why is that? This might be because when narcissism is diagnosed, there's an overemphasis or an over-reliance on the grandiose features of narcissism. So what are those, for example? Physical aggression, a need for power, a need for dominance, right? Competitiveness, a need to win over other people. When women are narcissists, they might not express it that same way. So something to consider there. And as mentioned, men also score higher in trait narcissism as well. So it's not just narcissistic personality disorder, but narcissism in general. But we're going to look at how this might be expressed differently in women and why. Because, there's some people that have called into question, are there really that fewer female narcissists? We would expect sex differences generally across a lot of personality traits and behaviors. So we shouldn't just assume that something is going on and, that there's going to be an equal number of male and female narcissists. But we might be underdiagnosing female narcissists. Why? Well, let's go on and see in the slides that are coming up. What do we know about narcissism in women? We said that in men, narcissism is grandiose, right? But in women, we tend to see one of the traits or features of narcissism that is expressed more in women is the vulnerable component of narcissism. So in research on this, we either tend to not see a sex difference or we see women score higher. So a little bit different than, most of the other features of narcissism where men score higher in those. If a narcissist is vulnerable, a female narcissist is vulnerable, how might that be expressed? Shyness, perhaps paradoxically to what you would think of a narcissist. Shame, hypersensitivity to things. Now that's an important one. And low self-esteem, another one there. Let's go on to the next slide. Some interesting points in this paper. There might be a generational shift in narcissism. In other words, the sex difference in narcissism could be closing. So twinge or twing, I have never learned how to pronounce that correctly, but this is a very famous psychologist who does a lot of research on generational shifts. I know I've mentioned their research in other contexts, such as a generational shift in risk aversion in past videos. Well, here is an example, a citation from this paper of a generational shift potentially in narcissism. These authors found that the sex differences in narcissism may be closing. Why is that? Well, because some expressions of narcissism might be expressions of agentic behavior, right? Or assertive behavior. So if women are becoming more agentic in life, if they're becoming more assertive, we have more boss babes, that sort of a thing, we could see, the gap closing there. But we don't know. A more recent meta-analysis here found no sex difference. Well, I should say no evidence for a generational shift in narcissism. So if that's the case, it's stable, right? Men are more likely to be narcissists, and it is what it is. Let's go on. Next slide. Narcissism and gender roles. So I mentioned in the previous slide that this can be related to agentic behavior. Why might we see this kind of sex difference in narcissism? Something we know, evolutionary psychology in general, broadly, biological sex differences lead to gender roles, right? So for example, men are physically stronger, so we see men become warriors, right? Being a warrior, a soldier, is a gender role. A biological sex difference is being big enough, to fuck people up. So yeah, you see biological sex differences lead to a lot of gender roles. And those might be agentic behaviors in men, competitiveness, leadership, competition, that sort of a thing, versus communal behaviors in women. So we have this agentic behaviors associated with men, communal or cooperative behaviors associated with women. That could be one reason we see a sex difference, because narcissism could just be kind of an extreme manifestation of agentic behavior, right? We see this agentic behavior being much more closely associated with narcissism than we do communal or cooperative behavior, right? Narcissists, narcissism in the dark triad, for example, closely associated with Machiavellianism as well, those 3 components, or now the dark tetrad, those 4 components, since they've added sadism to it. So you have this idea here, that individuals who might look out more for themselves, be more independent, that kind of a thing, more agentic, could, be one of the reasons why you see this diagnosed more easily in men. Women, female narcissists, on the other hand, might express their narcissism in ways that are less agentic. So they kind of go under the covers, covertly. We'll get into that a little bit as well. Let's go on to the next slide. So is this really just an expression of gender roles in that case? Klonsky and colleagues here, if that were the case, right, if narcissism is essentially an extreme manifestation of masculinity, then we should expect an association between masculinity and narcissism. But what do they find here? So for men, turns out it's true, right? Men who scored higher in this measure of masculinity also scored higher in narcissism. So more masculine men, more narcissistic. But women, on the other hand, who scored higher in femininity, also scored higher in narcissism. So that's not what we would expect, right? Because higher in femininity should be associated with that communal role, right? Or behavior or disposition, as opposed to agentic. But that's not what we see here. So it's not necessarily the case that it's simply a manifestation of masculinity, narcissism. Perhaps rather it's a manifestation of extreme expressions of traits, right? Highly masculine men, highly narcissistic men, highly feminine women, highly narcissistic women. So we have these 2 things where people might just be expressing their traits or their personalities more extreme across multiple measures or multiple manifestations of that, right? Let's go on to the next slide. Where do we see big associations with sex and narcissism? So in men, we see that men tend to be more interpersonally exploitative, right? So kind of getting over on one or another. We see a lack of empathy. That part of narcissism, again, more strongly manifested in men. Why might that be? Well, women score higher in measures of empathy pretty much across the board. As you would expect, stereotype with women, women being more empathetic, very well supported by the research. A good example of what's called stereotype accuracy, the fact that our stereotypes often are accurate, at least as far as acknowledging mean differences between groups. Very well replicated in personality psychology, social psychology, this idea of stereotype accuracy. They tell you don't stereotype people, blah, blah, blah. On an individual level, yeah, anyone can fall anywhere, right? You don't want to fall into the ecological fallacy, but as far as recognizing differences between groups, yeah, we tend to be able to do that pretty well. So empathy, what can be said? Envy as well, so expressed more in men. The envious aspect of narcissism also more closely associated with men. But, we do have to ask, are these measurements in bias, or are these actual measurements of a sex difference, right? Because that's kind of what this paper is calling into question is, are some of these, in the measurements being used just bias, or are they actually reflecting real sex differences? I think some of these, items is probably pretty good evidence that they do reflect actual sex differences in this. Let's go on to the next slide. So narcissism in females, is it often misdiagnosed, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video? So vulnerable expressions of narcissism are more likely to be treated. That is, people who express vulnerable narcissism are more likely to seek help for that. And this is more common in women. Given that, that women who are narcissists are more likely to get into therapy, why do we not see women being diagnosed more with narcissism? If, it's kind of what we should expect as a hypothesis, but that's not what we see. A potential reason for this is because vulnerable narcissism might just be misdiagnosed as borderline personality disorder. So, that's another question there is, are some of the women who are being diagnosed with BPD actually just narcissists? Possibly, yeah, but we might just see sex differences in BPD as well. We can see sex differences in narcissism and in BPD. There's no reason to think, that the two are not real or anything like that. Let's go on. Next slide. So, narcissism and aggression. We know that narcissism is associated with verbal aggression, physical aggression, interpersonal and social aggression, that sort of a thing. Narcissists are more aggressive, both physically and non-physically. Why is that? Well, they're very sensitive to perceived injury, okay? And when someone, a narcissist in particular, when they experience this perceived injury, they're more likely to be angry about it, higher levels of anger, more likely to feel shame, humiliation, and all of that. And when people feel that way, what do? They lash out, right? I think everyone kind of knows this intuitively. You've all ran into people who are like this. So we know that the self-esteem faucets are sensitive to gender and the way that men and women respond. When men experience a threat to their self-esteem, they're more likely to try to get revenge, they're more likely to try to compete, that sort of thing. So they have a competitive response. Again, kind of like the gender roles that we went over, when women experience a threat to self-esteem, they're more likely to express a communal response. So to try to fix it, to try and level everything out, right? To try and balance it out. So men are, they kind of try better to get over, one up, right? To ascend again over their competitors or the people that put them down. Women are more likely to say, hey, let's kind of fix this problem or something. Let's move past this. Everyone kind of get on the same level. So yeah, some sex differences in how this damage to self-esteem is expressed and responded to. Let's go on now to the next slide. We know that narcissistic males, they have this higher proactive and reactive aggression. So what is that? They're more aggressive off the bat, and they're also more likely to react aggressively to, perceived threats, slights, attacks to their self-esteem is mentioned in all of that. And so we see, that hurt self-esteem in narcissistic men is more closely associated than it is with aggression, than it is with hurt self-esteem in narcissistic women. So yeah, when men experience that attack to their self-esteem, they're more likely to lash out aggressively than women are, which makes a lot of sense because we know another big sex difference is aggression. Men are simply more aggressive. But this doesn't mean that female narcissists are not aggressive, right? We know, for example, that female narcissists are more likely to be physically aggressive, but female narcissists can also express their aggression in non-physical ways. Relational aggression, and you can see women do some very damaging things this way, right? Relational aggression, gossip, ruining reputations, slut shaming, making up lies, all of that. And so this is a covert rather than an overt expression of aggression. Going behind someone's back to try to ruin them, getting them fired from a job or kicked out of school, cancel culture. There's been some research that indicates a willingness to cancel, or engage in kind of these extreme manifestations of social justice is also associated with vulnerable narcissism. And this is, again, these are political leanings and dispositions, again, that women are overrepresented in. So you have cancellation, the woke, and all of that. Women are more likely to lean toward that. That's associated with vulnerable narcissism, and we see that that's associated with covert forms of aggression, like trying to ruin someone's reputation or get them kicked out of work or school or something like that. Men, on the other hand, overt aggression. What is that? Punching someone in the face, confronting them, getting in an argument to their face, and all of that. Let's go on to the next slide. So, narcissism and intimate partner violence or domestic violence. We know that men, are overrepresented in domestic violence. Some research has called this into question, and it's pretty good research. So, let's not just conclude that this is always the case, because often when people are in abusive relationships, they select partners who are. So there's a lot of mutual abuse there, and some very good research has indicated, Domestic violence might actually be pretty close between men and women. Certainly, one sex difference is when men are violent, they're more likely to cause serious injury. Again, sex differences in physical size, a willingness to use, you punch someone in the face as a big man. It's very different from being punched in the face by a tiny woman. But we know that women who commit, intimate partner violence or domestic violence, more likely to be narcissistic. If you look at female violent offenders in prison and all of that, yeah, narcissism is very, very common. But we also see, abuse that is not physical as well. So we see one expression of narcissism, for example, is entitlement, devaluing partners, lots of psychological abuse. We also see that narcissists tend to distance themselves from intimacy when they're in these kinds of conflicts. And, they might have much more hostile and angry communication patterns as well. They're not problem solvers. They're not, people that come to closure and resolutions and all of that. Let's go on. Next slide. As mentioned in the previous slide, narcissists are entitled and they're exploitative, right? And another trait of female narcissists, and this is true for male narcissists as well, is that they're hypersensitive to the perceived coercive behaviors of partners. So a narcissist might perceive controlling behavior in a relationship if it doesn't exist, right? They might perceive kind of innocuous behavior as controlling. They might think this person's trying to exploit me. This person's trying to take advantage of me. So I'm going to do that to them. I'm going to coerce them. I'm going to manipulate them. And that's, a way to regain control, a way to flip the tables, so to speak. So that's the kind of thing that you see with narcissists, is that perceived slight. This person's doing it to me, so I got to do it to them 2 times as much, right? And what do we see here? These expressions in female narcissists: bullying, supplication, so begging, manipulation, please don't do this, blah, blah, blah. And then disengagement, just distancing themselves and all of that. Sexual coercion, more closely associated with female narcissism. Now, this doesn't mean that sexual coercion is more common with women, but in narcissists it might actually be. Why is that? Probably because a lot of men who are not narcissists also engage in sexual coercion, right? So you just don't see that correlation as strongly with female narcissism. Females engaging in sexual coercion, not that common, right? As would expect from sex differences and libido, the libido gap, all of that. It's just not super common that women do that. But if you find women that do that a lot, good chance that they're narcissists, right? Let's go on to the next slide. And this here is the last one. Summarizing everything, what do we know? The big take-home points here: sex differences and narcissism. Women, if they're narcissists, are more likely to express this vulnerable rather than grandiose narcissism. Expressions of narcissism, the way that they react and lash out, much more likely to be covert, right? Ruining reputations than overt, confronting someone, getting in a fight with them or something like that. Physical aggression, much lower in female narcissists, but other forms of aggression they might express nonetheless. Social aggression in that case. Female narcissism, it might just be misdiagnosed as borderline personality disorder in some cases. So we could be, underestimating the prevalence of female narcissists, or, in that case, we'd probably be overestimating the prevalence of borderline, because we'd be, slotting some narcissists into that category. Communal versus agentic nature of women. That can make narcissism less apparent in diagnoses, which is kind of the point of this paper. That this agentic expression of narcissism, this individualistic expression of narcissism, might simply be what we see, right? It's associated with grandiosity, and that grandiosity seems to be a lot of what people rely on when they recognize someone as a narcissist, be it in a clinical diagnosis or just out in the world. If you're familiar with narcissists, that might be the thing that you immediately associate with narcissism, right? All the way back to the myth of Narcissus, right? Grandiosity there. And finally, narcissism could be higher in more feminine women, rather than, being associated simply with masculinity across the board. The paper on that, it was just one paper on that, referenced in that, so I'm not going to say that's super conclusive, but I thought it was interesting enough to mention there. Anyway, I'm going to try to make another video for you guys on this topic of female narcissism, but I thought this would be a good introduction. Hope you guys liked it. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications. We have a Patreon. Think about joining, supporting the project. We got a Discord where we talk about all this stuff, come up with ideas for videos and all of that. Anyway, hope you liked the video. I'll make another for you very soon.